Then hopefully you can see my screen and it looks okay. All right. So thank you so much to you all for the invitation to present to the ECOLOPES group, and I'm always inspired by the work that you guys are doing. So it's an honor to be able to speak in this realm. So thanks for the invitation, and I'm excited to present today. So yeah, I have been now at the Technical University of Munich for 3 years. Where I lead the research group Urban Productive Ecosystems. So thank you very much for the introduction. That was a little bit of a description to what we do. And today I'm just going to be presenting one project of ours, and that is called the Biodiv Hubs project. And it's basically going or trying to bring biodiversity interventions into neighborhoods in the city of Munich. So I want to also frame the presentation with the emphasis that some of the project steps are just in the planning phase, and we haven't done the implementation yet. But I will also share some of the outlook of what we will be doing. So who am I? Who are we? You've heard a little bit about me and the Urban Productive Ecosystems Group. We are a very interdisciplinary bunch of researchers that aim to bridge urban ecology, agroecology, social ecological research, and transdisciplinary research together under one hat or under one roof. And we're interested in understanding these relationships among biodiversity, ecosystem services, and human well-being. And most of our work is in the city, and I would say, well, at least my favorite habitat or ecosystem of focus are urban community gardens, like we see here on the left in Munich. This is called Essbare Stadt, or Edible City in Munich. And we also are always seeking to engage practitioners, other stakeholders in our investigations. And so, yeah, we are kind of spanning different ecosystems in the city. And today I'm just going to present on one project of ours that has now entered into a new phase. And so much of what motivates us to do the work that we're doing is the huge decline in biodiversity, or what we're calling this biodiversity crisis. And so we've seen a massive decline in the diversity and the abundance of specifically insect populations and many pollinators. So drivers such as pesticide exposure, climate change, habitat loss, disease and parasites, farming practices, etc. These are all the drivers of this biodiversity crisis that we are currently in. And especially pollinators are one group that we are interested in because they underlie a very important ecosystem service. So many of the world's wild species, but also agricultural crops rely on animal pollination. And so it is critical to think about and take serious this decline in pollinator biodiversity. And so one of the big then question is, okay, given land use change, agricultural intensification, but also urban intensification and urbanization generally, a question is, what is the role of cities in supporting biodiversity and specifically providing habitats for insect pollinators? And so places such as city parks or rooftops or urban gardens may become important habitats for biodiversity. And as urban ecologists, we're interested in understanding these patterns of biodiversity in the city. So we know that urbanization can also be a big driver of biodiversity loss, but we also know that urban habitats that I just described, so forests, parks, gardens, etc., can provide important habitat for plants and animals and have been shown to be really important spaces for native species, as well as non-native species that are introduced into urban areas. And so I think it's important to think of cities as not just these wastelands, but as a constellation of species that can live in cities. And cities and urban environments, like we see here, can be an opportunity for biodiversity conservation. And although there are a lot of activities around biodiversity interventions in cities, we're still lacking information on how we can mainstream different approaches across ecosystems and cities of diverse contexts. And so there are some open questions, including how do we mainstream biodiversity initiatives across cities, and where do opportunities lie, and where may there be challenges? And this is one of the funding streams of the Federal Agency for Nature Conservation in Germany. So they're really putting a main focus on urban nature and nature conservation. Also because a majority of Germany's population is urban. And so I like this picture of this wild bee conservation area that has been installed in Mauer Park in Berlin. So if you're ever in Berlin, you can walk by Mauer Garden and see the ways that they're already implementing conservation strategies. And because cities are designed, built, and used by people, and the potential habitat niches for biodiversity are built and designed and created by people, it's really important to involve people in conservation initiatives. And so the people that live and dwell in cities, as well as the people that are planning and governing cities. And so this is where transdisciplinary research approaches that are involving diverse knowledges and stakeholders is especially fitting, and where stakeholders can participate in the research design and the conduction of research. So I think I'm probably preaching to the crowd. A lot of you are already doing this already. And so I will just say that, or I'll just echo or preach to the to the people and say that this is incredibly important in urban areas. And there are some really cool projects that are engaging people in community mapping exercises, or roundtables and workshops with residents. So to think about, okay, where can we support biodiversity in the city? Where can we create shared landscapes with wildlife? And so one ecosystem and habitat that continues to fascinate me are community gardens, in which many different people are collectively or individually working in allotment plots. So gardens can be very important for supporting the biodiversity of plants and animals alongside food and flower production. And gardens are supporting both planned and unplanned, native and non-native biodiversity. So you see here this community garden in Munich called Stadtacker, and this is a collectively managed community garden where groups of individuals are deciding on, okay, well, what plants do we want to grow this season, who gets to harvest what, and who takes on different roles and management tasks. And I want to argue that community gardens are really an ideal living laboratory to co-create, to test, and implement biodiversity conservation strategies with gardeners that can be then transferred and mainstreamed across other ecosystems in the city. And this is important because although gardeners are already conducting biodiversity friendly initiatives, so just like what I showed in the last slide about in Mauer Garden, the impact of these gardening strategies are not yet systematically researched, nor how this knowledge can be transferred to other ecosystems. And so this is really framing the context of our research today. So if we're using and we're considering the garden as a laboratory, we can then test in this controlled area with a set group of people different biodiversity interventions that can then be brought out into city neighborhoods surrounding them. So here we can think about developing these biodiversity interventions in gardens, evaluating these interventions, and then bringing them out into the gardens. And so we are thinking about moving into schoolyards or housing associations, churches, etc., and bringing in other forms of knowledge, other forms of expertise, other stakeholders. And also accompanying this will be educational formats, networking with other relevant institutions, and doing a lot of acceptance building around biodiversity strategies in the city. And so this is forming the basis of our work now in Munich, where our goals are to increase biodiversity in community gardens, but also bring this into neighborhoods based on our research in the gardens. We want to elevate the participation and the education of neighborhood residents and support them in biodiversity interventions. And we want to anchor the project in the framework of the biodiversity strategy of Munich and spread the concept to other municipalities. So there is a lot of movement around biodiversity conservation in Munich. There's the biodiversity strategy of Munich. And so the city is taking a lot of steps to promote biodiversity. And now we are wondering, how can we align our goals to align with this strategy and achieve the strategy's aims. So here, just to focus on this first goal around our research and thinking about how can we create these evidence-based interventions that can be brought out of the garden into city neighborhoods. So first, what we've been asking over the past 3 years in community gardens in Munich and Berlin is, what is the biodiversity of plants and pollinating insects in gardens? Which features within gardens, as well as in a surrounding landscape, can support plant and pollinator diversity and associated ecosystem services, so namely pollination as an important ecosystem service. And can factors that we find through research that are correlating or predicting plant and insect pollinator diversity, as well as pollination, be then implemented in the gardens as well as in neighborhoods to promote biodiversity and services in these gardens in future years? So first we need to know, okay, what factors of gardens may be important for pollinators. And here we're focusing largely on wild bees, as wild bees are significantly under pressure and we're losing species rapidly. And they are also they're also of high interest to urban gardeners and gardeners in general, and have kind of become this like flagship organism that people are really getting behind. And so we thought that using wild bees, they're not just ecologically important, but they're becoming increasingly socially important, and can be a way in which we also get people on board with pro-pollinator and pro-biodiversity interventions in general. So we know that bees need diverse flower resources. They also need nesting resources, whether this is dead wood or open soil or dry stone walls, etc. And so urban habitats need, if they want to support bees, they need to support or create these different habitat niches. So we're interested in, okay, taking these different gardens as our habitat. What are different factors that are associating with bee diversity? So is it grass cover? Is it bare soil? Is it the trees and shrubs? Is it the flower diversity? Or is it simply the landscape context? So if you're in a very urban landscape, then it may or may not be as important to have flower resources. And so we always need to think about this landscape interaction when thinking about these local resources that are being provided for mobile organisms. So we started in working in 18 community gardens in Berlin in 2020, and now we are working in 30 community gardens in Berlin and Munich in 2021 and 2022. And if you want to see more about which gardens we're working in and learn more about them, and you can read their different profiles, I welcome you to read our website, where we have these different profiles highlighted. And so what we do is we select these gardens so that they vary along an urbanization gradient, so that we can take that landscape context into account. And so here we're just measuring the amount of imperviousness surrounding these gardens. So here is a garden in Olympia Park in Munich. And then because these gardens vary in their size, we create a standardized 20 by 20 meter plot in which we conduct our research. And so what we do is we have been observing flower visitors over the course of 3 years. We set up what we call pan traps or passive sampling for pollinators to look at abundance as well as the abundance of pollinator groups. We do vegetation mapping as well as ground cover mapping. So looking at, okay, how much bare soil is available, how much plant diversity is available, what are the different flower colors as well as species that are available. And then we also just look at what may be different habitat structures that are good for, or predicted to be good for pollinators. So whether it's nesting aids like insect hotels or dead wood or bare soil, etc. To look at pollination and to measure this ecosystem service, we also do pollination experiments where we set out these plants. So we've used strawberries, jalapeno plants, but also wild plants like clover, to look at what is the effect of pollinator exposure on fruit production, and specifically looking at seed set, seed weight, as well as fruit mass. So here we put little bags over these strawberry flowers, and some are open to pollinators, and it's under the prediction that those that are open to pollinators will have increased pollination efficiency. And so here we may get these beautiful juicy strawberry fruits instead of small or somehow malformed fruits. We also conduct a citizen science project in which gardeners monitor the pollination on their plants. And so here, over the course of 2 years, we had gardeners observe their tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, pumpkin, zucchini, and strawberry over the course of the summer. And so gardeners monitor the growth of the plant, how many buds, flowers, and fruits that they have, and also the size of the harvested fruit. And we basically calculate the turnover from flower to fruit on these plants. And this has been a really fun project to watch gardeners get really excited about being scientists themselves and monitoring the development of their plants. So here's just a gardener has put on like, I am a researcher, leave me in peace. And they, oops, oh no. I don't know what just happened. And they also, have identified it. And then we also had a photo project. So people could take photos in the same place in the same location of the plants that they were monitoring. And this was then this was put together by our colleagues at the Museum of Natural History in Berlin that have now put together this photo montage of this gardener's documentation. So in Berlin alone, we have documented over 100 species of wild bees in these gardens. And this is about 40% of all bees recorded in Berlin. And this was just in 1 year. And 25 of these species are on Berlin's red list. And so here are just some of these bee species. We've also found that the bee traits, so the individual characteristics of these species are associated with the plant diversity in the gardens, the ground cover in the gardens, as well as the surrounding landscape context. So we found that cavity nesting bees are more likely to be found in gardens surrounded by higher landscape imperviousness, or just like the amount of built infrastructure. We've also found that ground nesting bees are more likely to be found in gardens with more bare ground cover. So like this bee above here. And we've also found that more pollen specialists, so these are these bees that are focused on one or a couple of plants, are more likely to be found in gardens with higher plant diversity. Whereas those gardens that are in more urban landscapes we find more generalist species. And so this makes sense. This has been shown to be also in other studies. And so our work is aligning with work already on bee functional traits and urbanization. We've also found that the plant species richness in gardens is in general very good for, or positively predicts wild bee species richness. So the number of wild bee species, as well as the number of wild bee species in general. And if we look at the specific indices of biodiversity, such as the Shannon's index and functional dispersion, we also find that this has a positive impact on the functional diversity of wild bees. So just the diversity of traits that we're finding of species in these gardens. And for the pollination of plants in the gardens, we find that, maybe not so surprisingly, that the factors that are predicting seed mass or fruit mass are largely varied by the plant species. So again, these plants that we set out in the garden, some of them open, some of the flowers open to pollinators, some of them closed. We find that in general, pollinator diversity often promotes pollination of these plants, and landscape imperviousness often negatively influences pollination. but actually the urban environment could be providing some new farming opportunities. So we find that like increased temperature or light intensity has a positive impact on chili or on jalapenos. And actually pollinator diversity and floral resources have negative influences. But we do find that this often is dependent on these interaction effects. So like what I mentioned before, that we need to think about the landscape context when we're talking about floral resources or habitat resources for pollinators. So here I'll just walk through a little bit slowly this chart. Sorry if I'm going too fast. I'm happy to answer questions in the end. How much time? I think I'm okay. So we find that when we look at these interactions effects, so for example, on strawberry, that the landscape context, so the amount of impervious landscape within the surrounding of the gardens, means that the influence of pollinator diversity on pollination of strawberries is affected. So if we have low pollinator diversity, or if maybe I should put it this way, if we have high pollinator diversity, then the impact of landscape imperviousness, especially in the, or how can I say this easily? I practiced this before, and now I've already messed it up. But okay, I'll put it this way, that we see a really good effect on pollination of strawberries in landscapes where we have low imperviousness and high pollinator diversity. But if we're in a landscape of high landscape or high imperviousness, then this effect of pollinator diversity will basically be very little, or even when we have low pollinators. So really this positive effect of pollinators on pollination depends on landscape imperviousness. And when we think about the floral richness in the gardens, this may also influence the impact of pollinator abundance on pollination, and in this case, on buttercup. So here, floral richness, or the effect of pollinator abundance, where it's high, is regardless in gardens across this floral richness gradient. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily matter if pollinator abundance is high, whether you have a lot or a little floral resources in your gardens. And you could also flip it the same way. So if you have high pollinator abundance, or if you have high floral richness, then the effect of pollinator abundance is not necessarily as strong. Okay, so I think we've gotten to most of the diagrams, and now I'm just moving into some nice photos. So what we see is through these correlations, or through these predictions that our models show us, we see that gardeners can play an important role in designing their gardens to promote pollinators, and maybe to also promote pollination of their fruit of their crops. And so we see that gardens can host a diversity of, here I've shown wild bee species, also different traits of these bees. We also see endangered or specialist species. We also see that nesting resources and also foraging resources may be important for bees. And we've also found that bare soil, sand, ground cover, and dead wood are important for wild bees. But often these are resources that are relatively scarce in urban environments. So cities like to, for at least Munich, for the most part, likes to be tidy, to clean dead wood up. And so these are actually then these resources that are being taken away or removed that could be a resource for biodiversity. And so if we think about gardeners as being key agents in creating habitat, the question is then, what may drive these pro-biodiversity, pro-pollinator behaviors? And so here we used the activity, or the participation in our citizen science project as an indicator of pro-pollinator behavior. And so we want to see, okay, what are these characteristics of gardeners that may get them to participate in pollinator conservation or pro-pollinator behavior, as indicated by activity in the citizen science project, where basically they were measuring their fruits and following their fruit development over the summer. And so we had them take a survey. So here's also one of our gardeners in Berlin that did this, and with her clipboard. So going every week or twice a week to monitor her plants. And so each of these gardeners then took one of these surveys, and it was around their whether they're more production oriented, so interested in crop production, or whether they're more nature oriented and interested in being in nature through gardening. We ask them about their attitudes towards pollinators, their emotions, so how they feel when they see a pollinator, and then also their nature relatedness. And then we asked around their intentions in their gardening too. So whether they're doing already pro pollinator or pro insect conservation behaviors in their gardens. What we found is that emotions are really important. And so in general, the motivations to participate, for the most part, were just interested in learning about pollinators, but also interest in educational aspects of participating in the project. They felt that participating was a meaningful endeavor, particularly around nature conservation, and they wanted to also support scientific research. We also see that behavioral intention to get involved in pollinator conservation was driven largely by people's emotions. So people were fascinated in pollinators and felt joy towards pollinators. And so this was a positive predictor of participating in the project, or they felt angry towards pollinators. And this was a negative predictor of not participating in the project. So we also, as a control group, asked people that did not participate in the research. So again, this shows that, gardeners are relatively interested, at least this sample are interested in pollinators and biodiversity and want to take action in their gardens. And we see this already in the interventions that gardens are taking as a community. So for example, this sand structure that a community garden has implemented. We also see this within the individual plot. So gardeners implementing things like these small biotopes for insects or amphibians in their gardens, or just being super jazzed and wearing pollinator t-shirts. So the range in which you get excitement for biodiversity, for pollinator protection is varied and comes in different forms. But I think that this gets at my point at the beginning, that gardens can be really interesting places where we engage people in these dialogues around biodiversity, and then train ourselves to then communicate that to the broader public, especially those that may not have a place to garden or may not have the resources to manage a garden for biodiversity. So our next step, based on this research that we've been doing over the last 3 years, and okay, great, we have these correlations, we're writing scientific papers. Now we are into the second phase of a project where we are developing these measures for gardeners, and we'll eventually in the next 2 years bring them out into the neighborhood and do this evaluation within the garden and then evaluation in the neighborhoods. And so now our next steps are basically to already see what are these conservation measures that are already in gardens for biodiversity and also specifically for insects. We want to develop a Maßnahmenkatalog. It sounds way better in German, so I keep on using that word, but basically like a catalog of different interventions that people can implement. We will be selecting model neighborhoods in which to bring out these interventions and evaluate them. And we are also creating a demonstration garden and then doing the final implementation and evaluation of these interventions in the neighborhoods. So what we've been doing over the past 2 months, and what we did 2 weeks ago, was do this evaluation of what is already in the gardens. So here is this data sheet that we had with us, where we're okay, are there tiny forests? Are there dry walls? Are there hedges? Are there Kräuterspiral, these herb spirals? Sorry, my German English is now failing me. It's Yeah. And so here we basically went into the gardens 2 weeks ago or last week, 2 weeks ago, and documented what was there and whether or not there was like some sort of like educational component. So here's just one example of the spiral that a garden has created in Ofanstis in Olympia Park. And some of these are very small interventions. So I really like this one. Again, this was just like maybe a half a meter where someone has put a little stick with a sign that says this is not play sand, or this is not sand to play in. Don't take anything away. This is a house for insects that live in this sand. Thank you. And so this is just like a very small little patch that we have now documented. We've spatially oriented it within the garden landscape. So this is just one of these smaller inventions that people do. And then when there's also these like Benny's hecke, or these deadwood piles that people also create. That's more of like a larger scale, maybe community initiative. And so we're documenting both of these different interventions. And so this creates this baseline so that we know, okay, if we create or if we implement a different conservation interventions, what may be fitting for these gardens? What may they be lacking? What do they have already? What may be lacking? What could be feasible to implement? Because some gardens may not have the capacity to create a tiny forest or to implement sand structures, whereas others may have more of the capacity to do so. So what we're doing is we're starting to build this Maßnahmen catalog, or this catalog of interventions based on our research already, and also then based on what we see in these gardens already, to think about what may be feasible, and creating then steps and guidelines for each of these different interventions. And to move this then out of the garden into the surrounding neighborhood, we are selecting 4 model neighborhoods in Munich. And so these are, 2 of them have already been decided on, and 2 are still to be selected. And we're doing an analysis of built infrastructure, of sociodemographics, of Bürgerbeteiligung, or citizen participation and activation in these neighborhoods. And we'll be selecting these within the next 2 months. And so within these model neighborhoods, we'll be then bringing out these different interventions into semi-open space, as well as private spaces. So trying to get the building communities to think about putting something in front of their yards or in their Hinterhofs or their courtyards. And then within these neighborhoods, we are also surveying neighborhood residents about their interests, their motivation, and their intention in insect conservation, as well as how interested they are in citizen science projects. So here we're conducting workshops on implementation, talking about hurdles as well as solutions to these hurdles. And within each of these, we will be creating what we're calling a biodiv hub, which is a form of a living laboratory in which all of these activities will happen. And so we've also just started doing this over the past 2 months. So here's just an example of us starting to do these workshops with gardeners in Berlin. And so here's my colleague Ulrike, where she's talking on the right to a group of gardeners in their garden to talk about our findings thus far. Here are potential interventions. What are possibilities? What are challenges? And so within this dialogue, we can then also basically get feedback already through this process to tailor our suggestions that we will co-create with these gardeners. And so again, this idea of this biodiv hubs is to move outside of the garden and to move into these different areas of city neighborhoods where we can activate and accompany neighborhood residents in their different urban greening projects, and to improve the biodiversity and the nature experiences around them. So here we will be offering workshops, guided tours, online question and answer sessions, and trying to create learning places and places where people can feel safe to experience or to experiment, have also just the support to maybe implement things in their living environments collectively with their communities. And so, yeah, if you're interested in if you live in Munich and you're interested in some of these events, let me know. Some of them are already starting in the next couple of weeks. I think the next one is maybe in 2 weeks around gardens in the winter. There are many open and public events that we will be carrying out. And so what's important is that our work is also grounded in the biodiversity strategy of Munich. And so to align what we are doing with political activity that's happening, and basically, a form of, or to just align what activities are already happening that are funded and supported by the city. And so I just showed this environmental education. This is Umweltbildung, sorry, this is in German. But there are definitely other ways in which this idea of this biodiv hubs and this neighborhood-based initiative will be achieving these different aspects of the biodiversity strategy of Munich. So here, this is, trying to get biodiversity into public green spaces, to use different, or to create Gebäude, this is what you guys do, Gebäudebegrünung, or like facades and balcony greening. And then to do a lot of, environmental education and also just public engagement. And also to cooperate with different city stakeholders. And so what this will be then accompanied by is these roundtable discussions. So also 2 weeks ago, we had our first roundtable with the Ministry for Environmental and Climate Protection, and they gave feedback on the model neighborhoods, our different activities, etc., and where their activities are aligning with our initiatives. And so much of this communication, public relations, and networking are occurring across Munich and across Berlin with our collaborators at the Museum of Natural History in Berlin, who have an expertise in citizen science. And so here we've already, developed our website where we will be having these different interventions and where people can have like a different, a guideline for how they could implement a deadwood structure in their gardens. Here's my colleague Suzanne presenting again on our research and giving these kind of workshops, as well as a podcast, Beats and Bones from the Museum of Natural History. So I know this is then limited to the German speakers, but this is a really nice podcast that I would recommend. And so to conclude, as we are now embarking on this project, and I know that I'm not necessarily showing how we've now already implemented interventions into neighborhoods in Munich, but I've given you now a glimpse into our approach, and we are now at the very beginning of this phase. So I like to show this timeline. We are at the beginning of the project, and we're still in many deciding stages. So for example, deciding the other 2 neighborhoods where this will happen. But we are, really excited about this, and also about expanding our transdisciplinary network. And I think given your all expertise in urban design, in urban planning, in architecture, and biodiversity, and urban ecology, we can definitely find synergies to work together, and also just would love to have your input. So with that, I will say thank you again for inviting me to speak, and also to all of the partners that are behind this research, and that's the Bürgerstiftung München, Green City, Münchner Umweltzentrum, e.V. und Ökologische Bildungszentrum Munich, as well as my collaborators. A special thanks to Susanne Karl-Lebowski, Ulrike Strom, and all the field teams and researchers, including Astrid Neumann, who has done a lot of the insect ecology research, and also I've used a lot of her beautiful wild bee photos today. And also just a general shout out to the Urban Productive Ecosystems Research Group, all of the gardeners in Berlin and Munich, and to the funding agencies that are now supporting this work, especially into the implementation phase, where, of course, it takes a lot of funding to be implementing stone structures, sand structures, deadwood structures, flowers, etc., across the city of Munich. So thank you also to the Bundesamt für Naturschutz for funding this work. And with that, I know I'm a few minutes over, but thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Find out more about our research on www.ecolopes.org and on our social media platforms.